Sego se waguego wat konhoratu zinicho tagonada renawi zitawageno so that Ryan Yojats na wahta ni dawageno. Greetings to all of you here today. Welcome to my home. My name's Ryan DeCaire and I'm from Wahta Mohawk territory. I just introduced you in the language of my people. We call ourselves Ganya Gehaga and we call the language Ganya Geha. But to you, you likely know it as Mohawk. And you also probably think you never heard of any words in Mohawk, but I can guarantee each and every one of you know a few of them. Think of, for example, Toronto. That comes from the word garunto, meaning where there are trees in the water. Or how about Ontario? That comes from the word ganyaderio, meaning a beautiful lake. Or why not Canada? We know that comes from ganata, meaning a town or a village. Just thinking about those words makes you realize how important Indigenous people are to this land base. So Ganyageha, our language, we know that it used to thrive in our territory, which is here, modern day Southern Ontario, Southern Quebec, and a good chunk of New York State. But now it's a little bit of a different situation. We only have about 1,000 speakers, give or take, which make up maybe 5% of the population. And most of those speakers are over the age of 70. So we know the reason for that. That's for things like colonization and assimilation and marginalization, among many other reasons. And I could talk to you about those things, but I'd rather talk to you about really what it takes to keep those languages strong again, to keep Kanyakeha strong again. So even though I was born and raised in a Mohawk community, Wahta, as I mentioned, I couldn't speak the language. Most of us couldn't. Could say things like hello and goodbye and count from 1 to 3. That's pretty well it. That's because it wasn't present in our everyday lives. There was a time where people decided to no longer pass it on to a new generation. But even though that was the case, I always had a yearning to learn the language. I always felt that if I'm going to identify myself as Ganyagehaga, as a Mohawk person, I'd at least know some of the language. And so as a young man, I remember the first thing I did, I called up these 2 older ladies in my community who were speakers of the language. Their names are Grace and Lila. And I asked them if they'd help me. In particular, I asked them if they'd let me record them telling stories in the language. I think about that time and how amazing it was to hear the language and how beautiful it was to hear them speak it. But as beautiful and nice as it was, the problem was I didn't understand a word. Because of that, I didn't really know what to do with those recordings, so I put them in a box somewhere. And to be honest with you, I forgot that I ever had them. It was kind of a wake-up call for me because I realized that I wasn't going to learn this language overnight. I wasn't going to learn it from one visit with the older people. I wasn't going to learn it from an app or just one night class. It wasn't going to go in my head through osmosis. I felt that if I really wanted to speak to the older people in the community, I had to structure my life around becoming a speaker. And I really wanted to connect with this one guy named Tommy. Tommy was a speaker, a first language speaker, and he drove my school bus in high school. So I got to see Tommy every morning and then every afternoon. And he was also that guy in the community that everybody felt they could depend upon to do anything for them if there were an emergency. So I felt that I knew Tommy really, really well, but I knew him through English, and English was his second language. I wanted to get to know Tommy through his first language. I wanted to get to know his thoughts and ideas and opinions and expressions and ways of seeing the world, his history, how he grew up through his language, through Ganyak Geha. So being this really young guy and gung-ho to do whatever I could to learn this language, I remember it, I moved away and I started studying in an adult immersion program to become a speaker of Ganyak Geha. I remember being about 3 months into it and feeling like, yeah, I feel like I'm getting closer and closer to the point where I can identify as a speaker of this language. And even though I was almost there, my dream to speak to Tommy never materialized. It never happened. And that's because Tommy died. He died at the age of 68, just like that, from a heart attack that nobody knew was coming. It was tough on me because I really loved Tommy and I really wanted to get to know him in that way. But it was also tough on me because at that moment, I, I realized that maybe this language is hanging on by a thread, and that for more people, if we were going to lose more people like Tommy, it was going to become more and more challenging for people like me to become speakers ourselves. So I want you to take a moment and think, whether you're Indigenous or not, maybe you see yourself in this story. Let's say you're Chinese, maybe you're Nigerian, maybe you're Italian, and you have family who don't speak English and you don't speak their language. Have you, for example, ever tried to have a conversation with your grandmother and she doesn't speak your language and you don't speak hers? Or maybe the thought of your language is just that, a thought. What's that feeling like? What was the feeling like? Knowing that you're connected to this unique and beautiful civilization that's developed over thousands of years, yet you can't hear those thoughts, opinions, beliefs, philosophies, expressions, and ways of thinking through the language of that civilization and culture. Because of that, you don't really feel Chinese. You don't really feel Italian. You don't really feel Nigerian. And because of that, you don't really feel like you know your family. And because you don't feel like you know your family, you don't really feel like you know yourself. That's exactly how I felt. And it's how my community feels when they can't speak their language. It's how I felt when I couldn't speak to Tommy in his language. But when I think about it, I guess the only big difference is that we don't have the old country to go back to, where it's spoken by millions, where we know that the opportunity will always be there for us to learn it if we ever want to. And we know that somebody's going to continue it on. And for us, we're losing speakers faster than we're creating them. So you might think that my reason, my push, my drive to become a speaker of this language is because of what's at stake, this feeling of impending doom, that if we don't do something about it right now, we're never going to have the opportunity, and how that's going to have a negative consequence on our communities and to the globe, to human beings on a global scale. But when I think about it from my experience and also spending time with others in a similar journey, I realize that's not usually why people choose to learn their language. They choose to learn their language because of a yearning to connect. They want to connect to their identity. They want to connect to their land base. And they want to connect to their community in the past, the present, and the future. This tells us that language supports a sense of belonging and identity, and it's a sense of purpose, which leads to greater emotional and mental health, and then leads to greater social cohesion in our communities. It's why language isn't valuable in a vacuum or a book stored somewhere. It's valuable when it's used. It becomes valuable when we speak it. And to be totally honest with you, I'm often surprised that the language has hung on for this long. I sometimes sit there and go, wow, I can't believe that it hasn't just become a distant memory. And then I think the reason why it's hung on for this long isn't because of things like official recognition and official rights and money and high paid fancy jobs. It's hung on because of community. It's hung on because of individuals who've made the everyday conscious choice to speak the language, no matter what. And it's from these individuals that I've learned the meaning of agwegu yungwaderi hund. One way that language supports a sense of identity and belonging is that there's ideas, thoughts, and worldview embedded within words. Agwegu yungwaderi huntu means that we all have a responsibility, and that there's really no such thing as rights. There's no such thing as inherent rights. From our perspective as Haudenosaunee, or as from Ganyakehaga, we understand that everything in the seen and unseen world all have with them a set of responsibilities to maintain, to ensure that life continues. So if you think about it from our perspective, it's not as Spider-Man's uncle told him, with power comes great responsibility. From our perspective, it's the opposite. With responsibility comes great power, especially collective responsibility comes great strength. And this is how I choose to look at what it takes to make our languages strong again. So it's not one person's responsibility. It's not a specialization. It's not up to the experts. It's all of our responsibility to participate in the creation of a community of speakers. And it's got to be a conscious choice, an everyday conscious choice. And people often say, in order for the language to be passed on, we need to focus on the children. And that's true because we need to be focusing on intergenerational transmission, passing it on from parents down to children. But when people say the children are the future, although I agree with that, what happens is they often put the burden on the shoulders of the children that one day they're going to do something about it. One day they will speak it. But when you think about that, you realize that who are the ones shaping the identity of the child? In order to get children to speak it, those influencing the children to speak it, the parents need to speak it. Because if the language isn't spoken in the home, we've learned that it's very, very unlikely that the children are going to speak it themselves, that it's going to be passed on to a new generation. This is because I should say, home is where the language and culture and identity begin. And then it's in the community later where it thrives. So just hearing this small story about our language, maybe it causes you to think about a language that you'd like to keep strong yourself. To you, and especially to those who are dealing with a language that's struggling, like the many Indigenous languages across Canada and the United States and the world, I'd say you can definitely make it happen. You can play an extremely good, positive role in strengthening these languages. But in order to do it, you have to play a role and you have to make the choice, the conscious choice to speak it, no matter what your situation. You have to speak it every day. To you, and especially if you're a parent or a teacher or a young person who influences children today or might in the future, you need to make it your identity. You need to speak it every day. That's because it's all of our responsibility. And I don't mean to suggest that it's easy. It's not. There's many days where I feel like, wow, this is maybe too steep a hill to climb or too hard a road to hoe. But then I realized that there are glory moments along the way where you realize you're reaping unbelievable benefits associated with taking on that responsibility, associated with deciding to speak every day. For me, I just recently, I was going through some old boxes in my house when I was cleaning up, and I found these old tapes. And I thought they were my old high school mixtape. So I plugged them in all excited to listen to some songs. And to my surprise, I heard Grace and Lila telling stories completely in the language about how the community had changed since they were young. That was the second time I heard those stories, but it was the first time I understood them. At that moment, I realized how amazing it is to speak Kanyakea, to speak this language, and how awesome it is to know that my future children and the future generations will understand them too. Nyawakoa, thank you for listening.